everyone, welcome to KindaTV, the home of Carmilla, with me, your host, your friendly neighborhood Natasha, aka the actress who plays your favorite broody lesbian vampire. Hopefully your favorite broody lesbian vampire. If you follow our KindaTV social channels at KindaTV_ on Twitter and Instagram, you may have noticed that I recently posted a mini teaser video for this video.
These are my confessions.
Got a confession. Now that the movie is coming out, which you can pre-order at the link in the description below or find out more about at carmillamovie.com, it is time for me to get this off my chest. And it involves this little book. This little book you may have seen before by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. That's right. It's so hard for me to say this. I've never fully read front to back this book that our web series is based off of. Whew! There you have it. I feel moderately ashamed, but I do remember before I shot the movie, my lovely co-star Elise Bauman did ask me if I had read the novella, and I was like, admittedly no, I only ever read the Coles Notes, and she was like, oh man, me too, can I borrow your copy when you're done with it? And I said yes, but never got around to it. I have a good reason, I swear. Basically, because our little web series is a feminist version of this cautionary tale about female sexuality, I didn't want to be too influenced by the way that Carmilla was perceived, because I know that she is a little bit more villainesque in the book. I did read the Coles Notes, I know what happens, and I did read the important parts so I knew a little bit more about her past, but I didn't want it to have too much weight when it came to the way that I portrayed her. Second reason may also be my self-diagnosed ADHD. But since I got the nudge to do these more personal vlog style videos, I thought what a great opportunity to read it for the first time with all of you. Storytime theater with Natasha. Okay, here we go. This kind of feels like a reoccurring nightmare I have where I'm back in middle school and I have to read books out loud in class. Chapter 1, An Early Fright. In Styria, we, though by no means magnificent people, inhabit a castle or schloss. A small income in that part of the world goes a great way. 800 or 900 a year does wonders. Scantily enough, ours would have answered among wealthy people at home. My father is English and I bear an English name, although I never saw England. But here in this lonely and primitive place, where everything is so marvelously cheap, I really don't see how ever so much more money would at all materially add to our comforts or even luxuries. My father was in the Austrian service and retired upon a pension and his patrimony, and purchased this feudal residence and the small estate on which it stands, a bargain. Nothing can be more picturesque or solitary. It stands on a slight eminence in a forest. The road, very old and narrow, passes in front of its drawbridge, never raised in my time, and its moat, stocked with perch and sailed over by many swans, and floating on its surface, white fleets of water lilies. Overall, this, the Schloss, shows its many-windowed front, its towers, and its Gothic chapel. The forest opens in an irregular and very picturesque glade before its gate, and at the right a steep Gothic bridge carries the road over a stream that winds in deep shadow through the wood. I have said that this is a very lonely place. Judge whether I say truth. Looking from the hall door towards the road, the forest in which our castle stands extends 15 miles to the right and 12 to the left. The nearest inhabited village is about 7 of your English miles to the left. The nearest inhabited Schloss of any historic associations is that of Old General Spielsdorf, nearly 20 miles away to the right. I've said the nearest inhabited village because there is only 3 miles westward, that is to say in the direction of General Spielsdorf Schloss, a ruined village, with its quaint little church now roofless, in the aisle of which are the mouldering tombs of the proud family of Karnstein, now extinct, who once owned the equally desolate chateau which, in the thick of the forest, overlooks the silent ruins of the town. Respecting the cause of the desertion of this striking and melancholy spot, there is a legend which I shall relate to you another time. I must tell you now how very small is the party who constitute the inhabitants of our castle. I don't include servants or those dependents who occupy rooms in the buildings attached to the Schloss. Well, that's kind of rude. Listen and wonder. My father, who is the kindest man on earth, but growing old, and I, at the date of my story, only 19. 8 years have passed since then. I and my father constituted the family at the Schloss. My mother, a Styrian lady, died in my infancy, but I had a good-natured governess who had been with me from, I might almost say, my infancy. I could not remember the time when her fat, benignant face was not a familiar picture in my memory. This was Madame Perrodon, a native of Bern, who care and good nature now in part supply me to the loss of my mother, who I do not even remember, so early I lost her. She made a third at our little dinner party. There was a fourth, Mademoiselle de la Fontaine, a lady such as you term, I believe, a finishing governess. She spoke French and German, Madame Perrodon French and broken English, to which my father and I added English, which, partly to prevent its becoming a lost language among us, and partly from patriotic motives, we spoke every day. The consequence was a babble at which strangers used to laugh, and which I shall make no attempt to reproduce in this narrative. And there were 2 or 3 young lady friends besides, pretty nearly of my own age, who were occasional visitors for longer or shorter terms, and these visits I sometimes returned. There were our regular social resources, but of course there were chance visits from neighbors, of only 5 or 6 leagues distance. My life was, notwithstanding, rather a solitary one, I can assure you. How do you pronounce that?
Gouvernante.
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 Gouvernante. I feel, I feel like that rhythm is gouvernante. But there's no accent aigu on the E at the end. Very confusing. My gouvernantes had just so much control over me, as you might conjecture such sage persons would have in the case of a rather spoiled girl whose only parent allowed her pretty nearly her own way in everything. The first occurrence in my existence which produced a terrible impression upon my mind, which in fact never has been effaced, was one of the earliest incidents of my life which I can recollect. Some people will think it so trifling that it should not be recorded here. What? You will see, however, by and by why I mention it. The nursery, as it was called, though I had it all to myself, was a large room in the upper story of the castle, with a steep oak roof. I can't have been more than 6 years old, when one night I awoke and looked around the room from my bed, failed to see the nursery maid. Neither was my nurse there, and I thought myself alone. I was not frightened, for I was one of those happy children who are studiously kept in ignorance of ghost stories and fairy tales and all of such lore as makes us cover up our heads when the doors crack suddenly, or the flicker of an expiring candle makes the shadow of a bedpost dance upon a wall nearer to our faces. Man, that is a run-on sentence! I was vexed and insulted at finding myself, as I conceived, neglected, and I began to whimper, preparatory to a hearty bout of roaring, when to my surprise I saw a solemn but very pretty face looking at me from the side of the bed. It was that of a young lady who was kneeling, with her hands under the coverlet. I looked at her with a kind of pleased wonder and ceased whimpering. She caressed me with her hands and lay down beside me on the bed and drew me towards her, smiling. I felt immediately delightfully smoothed and fell asleep again. I was wakened by a sensation, as if 2 needles ran into my breast very deep at the same moment, and I cried loudly. The lady started back, with her eyes fixed on me, and then slipped down upon the floor, and, as I thought, hid herself under the bed. I was now for the first time frightened, and I yelled with all my might and main. Nurse, nursery maid, housekeeper, all came running in, and hearing my story they made light of it, soothing me all they could meanwhile. But, child as I was, I could perceive that their faces were pale with an unwonted look of anxiety, and I saw them look under the bed and about the room, and peep under tables and pluck open cupboards, and the housekeeper whispered to the nurse, "Lay your hand along that hollow in the bed. Someone did lie there, so sure as you did not. The place is still warm." I remember the nursery maid petting me and all 3 examining my chest where I told them I felt the puncture, and pronouncing that there was no sign visible that any such thing had happened to me. The housekeeper and the 2 other servants who were in charge of the nursery remained sitting up all night, and from that time a servant always sat in the nursery until I was about 14. Can you imagine trying to sleep constantly with someone sitting in the same room as you? That would be super weird. I was nervous for a long time after this. A doctor was called in. He was pallid and elderly. How well I remember his long, saturnine face, slightly pitted with smallpox, and his chestnut wig. For a good while, every second day, he came and gave me medicine, which of course I hated. The morning after I saw this apparition, I was in a state of terror and could not bear to be left alone, daylight though it was for a moment. I remember my father coming up and standing at the bedside and talking cheerfully and asking the nurse a number of questions and laughing very heartily at one of the answers and patting me on the shoulder and kissing me and telling me not to be frightened, that it was nothing but a dream and could not hurt me. Gotta say, Mr. Le Fanu, you sure do have a love affair with commas and love your run-on sentences, as beautiful as they may be. I was a little consoled by the nursery maids assuring me that it was she who had come and looked at me and laid beside me in the bed, and that I must have been half dreaming not to have known her face. But this, though supported by the nurse, did not quite satisfy me. I remember in the course of that day a venerable old man in a black cassock coming into the room with the nurse and housekeeper and talking a little to them and very kindly to me. His face was very sweet and gentle, and he told me that they were going to pray and join my hands together and desired me to say softly while they were praying, "Lord, hear all good prayers for us for Jesus' sake." I'm not ashamed to admit when I don't know what certain words mean. So, cassock. It is a full-length garment of a single color worn by Christian clergy members. I see. I remember so well the thoughtful, sweet face of that white-haired old man in his black cassock as he stood in that rude, lofty brown room with the clumsy furniture of a fashion 300 years old about him, and the scanty light entering its shadowy atmosphere through the small lattice. He kneeled, and the 3 women with him, and he prayed aloud with an earnest, quavering voice for what appeared to me a long time. I forget all my life preceding that event, and for some time after it is all obscure also, but the scenes I have just described stand out vivid as the isolated pictures of the phantasmagoria surrounded by darkness. Phantasmagoria. What a great word! Wow. And I'm gonna leave it there because I am a cruel, cruel mistress. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up, and thank you so much for watching it. Leave me a comment below. Let me know if you would be interested in hearing me read more of the Carmilla Novella leading up to the premiere of the film, which is coming out sometime fall 2017. All of our videos will be related to Carmilla in some way, including some awesome collabs with the beautiful Elise Bauman. I don't think you're gonna wanna miss those. Until then, keep it kinda classy.